Greetings, 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 greetings. Peace, love, harmony, and light. Man, listen, I'm going to just drop a little something for y'all. Once again, I'm just here to drop information, man. I'm just a vessel. You do what you want with the information. It's totally up to you. Information is for educational purposes, for the enlightenment of the masses. All right. Like I've been doing, I've been sharing videos and other information. Of course, I always like to give thanks to the great spirit, Mother God, for just the continuation of life. Thank you to my ancestors for, again, being a conduit, and using me as just pretty much helping me in finding my purpose. So I'm very thankful for that. All right. Now, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the whole slavery thing, because for me, we putting that in perspective, and just to let you know that a lot of things that you think you don't know, and a lot of times some of the stuff that you do know, there needs to be more information and facts or factual information that needs to be added so that we could have a complete storyline. Okay, because you see, it's a big puzzle. And there are a lot of missing pieces. Okay. Now, beyond any doubt, we know that we are the original people here. We have always been here. So we already know that. So that's already established, right? But you see, that whole slavery thing needs to be put in context and perspective. You dig? It have to be. So I'm just going to go and point out a few dates for you so we could put these pieces together. Because I want you to see that these millions and millions of slaves that they talk about that came here, all right, they were not dark-skinned people, all right? They were not so-called dark-skinned Africans. A lot of them were Africans, but they were not dark-skinned Africans. They were the pale man, okay? They were the pale Africans. As a matter of fact, if you go look at the etymology of African, don't believe anything that I'm saying. Go look at the etymology of African. You would see that they were called Africans before the so-called Negroes in the United States. It wasn't after until they gave us their names. They gave us their identity. It was trading places. All right. Keep that in mind. Remember the landmass that's now called Africa. It's been called so many different names. It has been called Libya. Okay. It has been called, that entire landmass at one point was called Ethiopia. And then before that, it was Asia. Okay, that's why you have a lot of these people right here trying to call us Asiatics, because they want to put us in Africa. They want to put us on that landmass. And they'll tell you, oh, well, all of us in the world was called this. And no, that's not true. We have always been on this side of the world. And the truth of the matter is the majority of them didn't know about us. That's why we were not on the world maps in the early times or in the ancient times. All right, because they were not aware of, the magnitude of the Americas. They didn't know. Yes, one or two Asiatics, okay, they traveled. Even our people traveled, right? But the point I'm trying to make is they didn't know how huge of a landmass the Americas was. All right. So let us put that whole slavery thing, just give you some more information on that, right? The slaves that they are talking about, they are literally the pale slaves, okay? It was, once again, you have different ethnic groups of so-called white people. And I'm saying so-called because nobody's white, all right? So when we're looking at slavery, that the slaves that came here, it was literally an influx of so-called white slaves. There was no need to get so-called black slaves because the people that were already here, they were dark-skinned people. So they already had that. So why, and keep in mind, brothers and sisters, slavery was, okay, all about commerce. It was all about commerce. It had nothing to do with the color of your skin. However, because this new land that was discovered, and then these so-called pale people, they were going through persecution all over the world. Okay, they were being persecuted. A lot of these so-called Jews as well, Jewish. Okay, they were being persecuted all over the world, imprisoned. Okay, shunned. You feel me? when our land was discovered, especially when a certain demographic or a certain bloodline, when they lost their power, all right, they came here into the Americas and they started to bring in these pale slaves. It was all commerce. But of course, they're not going to tell you it was slavery. They're going to call it indentured servitude. And some people may say, oh, well, you know what, Chief, it's different. No, to me, it's the same thing. It is just more of a diplomatic term. So that when you study their history, you will not realize that they were the slaves. Because they have made, trust me, a significant and it's literally effective effort to disguise their history. That's why there's no such thing as white history. But you have to look into it. So the whole slavery thing wasn't us. Yes, we became victims of slavery, of enslavement in our own land. Okay? Because there's no way they could have had these so-called black people running around while so-called white people was enslaved. All right? So they had to, incorporate so-called black slaves from South America, Central America. Of course, at that time, there was no such thing as Central America. It was just North and South America. All right? And they were taking these indigenous people from the Americas and literally bringing them all over the Americas. But the Africans who came here, all right, were the pale man. They were the Africans who came here. All the millions of them that came here, it was them. It wasn't us. It wasn't so-called dark-skinned people. The majority, a lot of these dark-skinned people that came here, as a matter of fact, they were actually working with the colonists. All right? They were working with the captains and the sailors because they themselves were looking for opportunities because they lost their power. Okay? They lost their power. And they saw an opportunity and I'm like, oh, you know what, man, listen, let's go to Turtle Island and make this thing happen. So let us talk about slavery here for a second. And we are looking at dates because you see, when you start looking at the dates and you start putting the storyline together, now it will start making sense. So let us go to 1865 when slavery ended, all right, or it was abolished, so to speak, or when the slaves were freed. They was freed in 1865. What slave do you think was free? It wasn't the so-called black man that was here, because the so-called black man that was here, we were Aborigines. We were called American Indians. So we still were we were free. Okay, we still owned our farms. The only thing is, all right, because of the power that they had, even if we were fighting each other, okay, deals were made where our farms would be used and we became workers on our farms. All right, that was the deal. But when slavery, they freed all the slaves. The slaves that were free was Caucasian slaves. And yes, a few Negroes in between. But the influx of slaves that were freed was the so-called white slaves. Okay? And that happened in June 19th. That's why I tell our people this whole Juneteenth thing is not about us. This 400 years of slavery is not about us. Okay? Them coming to a far land, all right? Them coming to a far land on slave ships in Deuteronomy is not us, it's them. But you have these Negroes running around thinking it's them. Okay? That is not us, it's them. That's their independence. That's their emancipation. That ain't got nothing to do with us. We just got caught up in the mix. In other words, we was in the wrong place at the wrong time, basically. But we were still in the right place because that was our home, if you get the drift. So when the slaves were freed in 1865, that was them. June 19th is about them. It's not about us. Celebrating this whole 400 years of slavery is not about us. It's about them. Okay? This thing was literally flipped around and told in reverse. Now, when you look at 1865, when they were freed, what did they do? At that same year, in December of 1865, the KKK was established. It was founded by who? By freed slaves. So who's the KKK? The KKK wasn't us. Okay? The KKK was formed by free slaves in 1865. But that same year earlier, in June 19th, the slaves were freed. They were freed. You dig? So put all this in perspective and realize what's going on. And the truth of the matter is, a lot of these slave owners, they were also dark-skinned people. Okay, the KKK don't hate you just because they hate the color of your skin. No, they hate you because they were enslaved by people who look like you and me. You feel me? There's always a reason for everything. And there's always a story behind everything. You just have to know how to put the pieces together. So the majority, I'm talking about the millions and millions of slaves that were free, all right, was Caucasian slaves. You had a few dark-skinned black, so-called black ones in there, but the majority of them that came here, the millions of slaves they're talking about, they were Caucasian slaves that came here. Okay? And then in December of 1865, the KKK was founded. It was created by the free so-called white slaves. You feel me? Okay? Then in 1867, you had the Indian Peace Commission. All right? You had the Indian Peace Commission in 1867. All right? And let me see the Indian Peace Commission. Now, y'all could always go read up on those things if you so choose. Okay? Go read up on those things. You could do that yourself. Okay. Also in 1861, around that time, well, actually in 1861, you had the Confiscation Act. Let me go back a little bit. Let me digress a little bit. Even before 1865. In 1861, you had the Confiscation Acts. All right. They were laws passed by the United States Congress during the Civil War with the intention of freeing the slaves still held by the Confederate forces in the South. Okay? The Confiscation Act of 1861 authorized the confiscation of any Confederate property by the Union forces. Property included slaves. So all that was the brewing, all right, that was leading up towards the slaves being freed in 1865. Because at that time, a lot of more so-called black slaves were being enslaved. So they started joining forces with these so-called white slaves, all right, and a civil war was about to erupt. So eventually they got freed in 1865, all right, and like I said, in 1867 you also had the Indian Peace Commission. The Indian Peace Commission, let me just read that a little bit for you. The Indian Peace Commission, also the Sherman-Taylor or Great Peace Commission, was a group formed by an act of Congress on July 20th, 1867 in order to establish peace with certain hostile tribes. Okay? Certain hostile tribes who was composed of civilized and initially free, later four military leaders. Throughout 1867 and 1868, they negotiated with a number of tribes, including the Comanche, the Kiowa, the Arapaho, the Kiowa Apache, the Cheyenne, the Lakota, the Navajo, the Snake, the Sioux, and the Bannock, sorry. And the treaties that resulted were designated to move the tribes to reservations to civilize and assimilate these native peoples and transition their societies from nomadic to an agricultural existence. So you have to see how we got tied into all this. And then you had in 1877 was what? The Reconstruction era. All right. The Reconstruction era, which was also the same year of the Jim Crow laws. The Reconstruction era, which was also the same year of the Jim Crow laws. So once again, do me a favor, go and look at those dates, study those dates, all right, and do your own research. See how all of this tie in and it makes sense. All right, because at the same time they were looking to free themselves, they were looking to fight us, indigenous people, for our land. All right. And of course, they had the help from the government. You feel me? Now, in 1893, the Dawes Commission or the Dawes Rules was created. You feel me? Now, you have to ask yourself, well, How is all that possible? Our people didn't care about no Dawes Rows, right? Because we knew that the land was ours. But it says, all right, the Dawes Rolls, also known as the final rolls, are the list of individuals who were accepted as eligible for tribal membership in the 5 civilized tribes. All right. So at the ending of the day, you had all these American Aborigines. They call savages, right? But some of them wanted to make deals. Some of them converted to Christianity. Some of them converted to Islam. A lot of them converted to the westernized so-called ideologies. So now they became the civilized ones. All right. They became the civilized tribes. So now you had the Reconstruction era. All right. And the Jim Crow era in 1877, where all that was leading up to take place. The Reconstruction was them taking land. All right. Taking land, forcing our people to assimilate, all right, the influx of the $5 Indians, you know, the Mongolians, all those people stepping up, claiming to be us. So that was the Reconstruction era, all right? And then they say, okay, man, listen, let's create this Dawes Rose Commission. All these people who want to work with us now, we're going to create a separate society, or a new set of Native Americans, so to speak. So we have to create a rose. All right. We're going to do a call. It's a final rose. It's a final call. All right. This thing is happening. It's after the Reconstruction. We did what we had to do. It's happening. We got a few so-called American Aborigines who are ready to work with us. So let's make this thing happen. So you had all this $5 Indians, like I said, being able to come on the Dawes Rows, but you had a lot of the original Americans who didn't want to be a part of that. All right, so keep that in mind as well. And that happened, the Dawes Rose Commission in 1893. I'm just giving y'all a few dates so y'all could see the transition of how things happen. All right, then you had in December of 1913, you had the Federal Reserve. This Federal Reserve was created. All right, because once they took control, all right, of this whole system, and I'm not just talking about Congress. Congress was already established. All right, in terms of you had the 13 colonies. Pardon me, not Congress, right? Not the United States, but you had the 13 colonies. The 13 colonies was running things even before the United States was created. And at that point, the 13 colonies consisted of many ethnic groups, including people who look like us, but they were not from here. All right. They are the Asiatics. All right. They came here and they were working with, a lot of mulattoes. So once again, do your own research. I'm just giving you some dates and some information to follow up. Then you had from 1914 to 1918, you had World War I. All right. Remember, their people were slaves. Their people were slaves. Why are you going to fight for your independence? Why did you have a Declaration of Independence? The only reason to have any type of declaration or make any type of declaration is because especially a Declaration of Independence, it means that you were not independent. You were slaves. So now you could see how all of this is tying together and who were the real slaves who came here. So now they had to fight this war, all right, to gain their independence. But in the midst of all that, it was an attempt to go free all the Caucasian males that was in prisons around the world, especially in Asia. All right. And when I say Asia, I'm talking about Africa. I'm talking about Europe. I'm talking about, Britain, all those places. They were slaves. They were enslaved by the nobles. And you know who the nobles were because I've done videos on that. So I don't have to get into that again because I don't want nobody to say I'm picking on them. But the truth got to be told. So that's what World War I was about. It was more so going around because they had first to gain their power, going around the world to free the Caucasian man. All right. And to take back their women that was held in captivity by you know who. OK. Then you had in 1921. All right. The so-called Black Wall Street was bombed. All right. Because we were still a striving people. We were still a striving people. We were the ones from the very inception who still had all the land. It was ours until all that was taken away from us. Then you had in 1928 to 1929, it was more attacks on so-called black-owned cities all across the country. All right? But yet still, they were not a superpower just yet. So then you had in 1939, you had World War II. World War II in 1939. All right. Then you had, of course, coming up into later times, you had more of the Civil War. Now, here's something you have to realize. The Civil War wasn't about us. It wasn't about so-called black people wanting rights. No, the Civil War was merely because you had a lot of so-called free white people in the North, right? But then in the South, the majority of the so-called white people in the South, they were slaves. All right. And then it was starting to look like the South was trying to impose on the North. And then when a lot of these so-called white people running around free in the North and they went down South, they were becoming slaves as well. Like I said, it had nothing to do with the color of your skin. As long as you didn't have your freedom papers, you were a slave. So the North was like, listen, man, you know what? We are tired of our people, okay, going into these territories down South and becoming slaves, even if they were white. So that was the initiation of the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement had nothing to do with us. Nothing. You feel me? Because the so-called black people that was actually slaves, they didn't care about them to give them civil rights. No, it wasn't. It was because of the so-called white people that were slaves. They were afraid of being enslaved because they were free. I'm talking about those in the North. It was a battle between the North and the South. And so-called white people in the North, all right, was afraid that slavery would come into the North and enslave these so-called white people. So they was like, nah, man, you know what? We're gonna have to make a sacrifice and fight for civil rights, even if, okay, it's gonna bring some of these so-called black slaves along. All right, because we are not gonna cut our nose to spite our faces, meaning that we are not gonna try to keep these so-called black people enslaved, right? While we ourselves end up being enslaved, because the South was a powerhouse. Okay. So the civil rights movement was that's what initiated, and that's what started, and that's what it was all about. The civil rights was about the white slaves. It was never about the black slaves. Our people just got caught up in the mix, and they used our people because we were more of a power. Okay. And I'm talking about more in power, more in number, and we own the land. So they made it seem like it was about us when it was truly about them. That's why they were the ones, okay, or were the ones who truly got emancipated, because it was really about them. All right. So keep that in mind. The civil rights movement was not about us. The abolition, the freed slaves, or the abolishment of slavery wasn't about us. It was about them freeing the Caucasian slaves. It wasn't about us. Like I said, we were just there and happened to get caught up in the mix. All right. So pretty much I just want to share that bit of information for you guys. You could do your own research. Don't believe anything I say. Do your own research. All right. But of course, coming up into further time in the 1970s, you had the welfare attack on the so-called black communities. All right. Where that was pretty much an attempt to break up the families. All right, break up the so-called black families so that the welfare came in. All right, well, you know what? You want welfare, you want help from the government. Well, the so-called black man cannot be in the home. And our sisters fell for that. I'm not mad at them because times was hard. All right, I'm not here to point fingers and blame anybody. All right, we all did what we had to do with what we had. Right. And then in the 1980s, you had the crack epidemic in all the so-called black communities. And then in the 1990s, you had the war on drugs, because everything that they introduced to us, it affects them as well. You know what I mean? It affects them as well, because they don't want you to know how connected so-called black people and what so-called white people are, because they were both enslaved by the system at the same time. But the truth of the matter is the so-called white slave outnumbered the so-called black slaves, because they couldn't enslave the indigenous people. That was part of the treaties that was signed. And of course, you know, the original people are us. All right. So that was just a little trip down history. All right. Do your own research. Do your own study. Just wanted to share that information with you. All right. One love. Peace.